Hello, hi, what's up? It's me, Karen, your favorite booktuber, and today I'm here to talk about the 10 best nonfiction reads of 2024. I read a total of 125 books. Of those, 66% were fiction and 34% were nonfiction. Of my nonfiction reading, I tend to love history, stories about marriage, stories about people who are forgotten, or, things that are kind of super gossipy at times. But yeah, these are the 10 nonfiction books that I read and really resonated with me, and I'd love to tell you about them. Number 10, we're going to kind of work backwards towards what I think is some of the more stronger works. We have Let's Get Physical: How Women Discovered Exercise and Reshaped the World. This is a book that is looking at how we've gotten to our current contemporary landscape of physical fitness, in which women use it as a way to, yes, possibly shape and change their body, but also something that is fundamental to their mental health and to having a life of, ease or whatever it may be. But this is looking at different almost anecdotes, I guess you could say, of women. We find out about how the first sports bra was made. We find out not exactly about Pilates, but the way in which boutique fitness has moved here to the Western world and become a bit of a commodity. There's a woman who brought yoga to the States and has a very interesting personal life. Then there's just all of these really fascinating characters, and we're seeing how in each almost decade, at first, physical fitness was pushed upon women as something they had to do in order to become more beautiful. But there's this evolution that comes, and a way in which each decade women are responding to the previous decade's expectations and subverting them. So it's quite an interesting read in that regards. The next book is Pockets: An Intimate History of How We Keep Things Close. Now, this is a very unexpected book that I read, and it's something that, it's a pocket. They're quite, you probably go about your life mostly not thinking about them. However, if you wear women's clothing, you probably have had that moment where you're wearing a dress and you're like, can you believe it? This dress has pockets. Or you are wearing jeans and you're like, my pockets are so small, I can't fit anything in them. And the author is really looking at the history of the pocket and how for the longest time pockets weren't really in existence, and then they started to come about, and the courts, the royal courts, were like, no, pockets are not good, because in a pocket you can hide a weapon. And so there were laws made about the kind of pockets you could have and who could wear pockets. And then the pocket became a space in which it was almost very gendered. Like, a little boy's pockets meant something. Like, what was the stuff that he would put in his pocket, and what would that say about who he would be as an adult, and how young girls' clothing didn't have pockets. And there's a few anecdotes of this young girl writing letters to the brand where she buys her clothes, and she's like, little girls have things too. Little girls have stuff they need to put in pockets as well. And so there's a way in which the pockets are quite gendered, and they stay quite gendered. I think there's a stat that the author includes about the real estate of women's pockets versus men's pockets. And I don't know, it was just a really engrossing read that after reading it, I found myself thinking about it more and more. The next book is The Last Love Song, a biography of Joan Didion. This biography came out while she was still alive, and it is not a perfect biography. I still think we need a biography to come out, another one, a more updated one, because this one is very lengthy. It is quite big, and there definitely are tangents that the author goes on that feel a little bit unneeded. There's a lot of excess information about Joan Didion's brother-in-law that I didn't need. But I think where this nonfiction book really excelled for me was really looking at Joan Didion's childhood and college experience and her early years as a working woman in New York City when she was working at Vogue. And you're seeing the ways in which her childhood experiences, the year that her family was traveling, following her father who was enlisted in the army, and just how these moments really impacted her, and how the first time she started to get migraines when she was about 7 or 8 years old, how she was living in a world of romantic opulence, but it was dwindling. It was on the down and out, and she had this very nostalgic air, and you're seeing that how that really informed her. And how this book really helped me understand Joan Didion better is that it showed the ways in which there were so many times where Joan Didion wanted to do a certain assignment. She really wanted to go to Vietnam, but no one would send her. And so because of each setback, that sort of had her come to her work in a very roundabout way. And that's why we have the work that we have of Joan Didion, because she wasn't able to write about what she really wanted to write about. No one would send her to Vietnam or to some of these other places. And I think since Joan Didion's writing is such a cornerstone of a certain time in America, I think it is really like adds to one's understanding of her. The next book that I read was The Stranger's House, Writing Northern Ireland. Now, this is a really slim book. It's very unusual in some regards. The author is contemplating what is Northern Irish literature, but also at the same time says that's kind of an impossible thing to ask or to make a sort of diagnostic answer towards. It's a hard thing to do, but the author is looking at maybe about 12 different writers and contemplating the ways in which the conflicts within Ireland have shaped these individuals and the touchstones within their work, and how there is a way in which this sort of understanding of constraint and just of natural beauty, but also this desire for independence is all just like thematically so central to their work. And it introduced me to a lot of authors who I didn't know about, a few that I already did know about. And I think if you have an interest in Ireland, this might be something that you want to check out to just kind of contemplate writing in a different way. Some of the authors that were mentioned were C.S. Lewis, Seamus Heaney, Anna Burns, Forrest Reed, and yeah, a few other people. Like, it was really just unusual, I thought, and I really liked it quite a bit. But one of the central things about this book is also contemplating the idea of like home and a home divided, and looking at the ways in which these authors were dealing with that as a sort of larger question within their work. The next book I want to talk about is The Silent Assassin. Sorry, not The Silent Assassin. It's The Patient Assassin, A True Tale of Massacre, Revenge, and India's Quest for Independence. Now, this is a really intense book that at times I had to take a little bit of a break from. The author is looking at Udham Singh, who is supposedly, and we find out more about this, the legend has it that he was in Amritsar when the Jallianwala Bagh massacre occurred. And if you don't know, a little bit of backstory here, during the subcontinent's quest for independence, there was a lot of unrest and turmoil within Punjab, and the British overseers were like, you know what, we need to shut that shit down in Punjab. And Sir Michael O'Dwyer, the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab at the time, ordered General Reginald something or other to make sure that there would be no like public protest or public meetings. And what ends up happening is in April 1919, the British massacre a lot of people. And this was a very shocking event in India, in the world. And for 10 minutes, the soldiers just fired into a crowd of people. If you've ever been to this spot in Punjab, you can see like the bullet holes on the wall. It's really crazy. But this event then inspired Udham Singh, who, as we find out more about him, was basically an orphan. It inspired him to promise, to vow, that he would avenge Punjab and this massacre that occurred. And when in 1940 he finds himself in London and he ends up shooting O'Dwyer. And this author is looking at who was Udham Singh, where was he going and moving through life. There's a time where Udham Singh came to California. He was living in the US. He got married here, but then he left, and he may have been to Russia. He had communist ties, and we're seeing like his life and the ways in which, you know, his 18 years old in 1990, and then almost 20 years later, he ends up killing O'Dwyer. And you're looking at the ways in which what could have happened, or like how is it, like were there moments in his life where it could have happened earlier? Like you're learning more about this character, who is quite a complicated man. And the next book that I want to talk about is To Anyone Who Ever Asks, The Life, Music, and Mystery of Connie Converse. Now, Connie Converse was a woman who I did not know about before reading this book. She was basically, like, I don't know, what year was this? She was born like a few years before Sylvia Plath and Joan Didion. And this is important because in the summertime, I was really contemplating the lives of like Sylvia Plath, Joan Didion, Connie Converse, Eve Babbitt, and looking at the ways in which these women were born like somewhat close to each other, but not really, and how as a result of that, they had what was it that they were able to do within their art and their craft, and did society aid them or not? And Connie Converse was a New England woman, I think New Hampshire, possibly Mass. I don't remember exactly right now, but she, quite academic, very like studious, but a real like, something was different about her. And she ends up leaving, she goes to college, she decides to quit college, she moves to New York, and she's having a very interesting life. She's making music, she's interacting with people, she's meeting people. That was a bad sentence, my bad. But she's, living a life of a young person in New York City. She's living in the West Village. It's very creative, it's really stimulating, and she's really smart and quite prolific, and she's creating music that is very novel. At one point she even gets onto television and shows her music, shows her singing. There's a way in which her craft was ahead of its time, but so also unique and singular, and could be considered quite modern even to today's standards. And the author is like looking at, well, why didn't her art take off? Why didn't no one listen to her music, really? Why do we not know her name? And she gives music a try, and then she decides, you know what, I'm done with music. She moves to Michigan. She gets really involved in the University of Michigan and that like academic space. She is really quite thoughtful. She's there when civil rights protests were happening, but she's also like still a loner, and she doesn't have like strong like ties with other people, and she's quite prolific in her writing, and still like she at one point decides to make an opera, and like she's doing all of these projects, but nothing is taking off. And then finally, when she's about 50 years old, she decides like no more, and she leaves her family. She tells them, I don't want you to look for me, I am leaving, don't ask me about it. And then the author is like trying to get more information to parse through like where could she have gone, what could have happened. And it is very just an intense read, because there's a way in which Connie Converse is someone who was quite brilliant and prolific and good at so many different things, but the world never really gave her its due attention, and it seems as if she felt quite upset by that, and her inability to really connect with people and to share her art in a greater capacity. And I think in that regard, there's something that's like, there's so many people like this who are quite brilliant probably, and we just don't know them, we just don't get to see them because, I don't know, maybe it's like fate or something, that the stars just aren't aligned for them, and it made me quite emotional. So that was that book. The next book I want to talk about is When Women Ruled the World, Six Queens of Egypt. Now, I read this book because I went on a trip to Egypt in May, a very impromptu trip that was incredible, and I wanted to do reading about Egypt, so I read some nonfiction, I read some fiction, and this was one of them. And this was a book that looks at ancient Egypt and six queens throughout the entirety of ancient Egypt. There was more than six, but this one really focuses on these six queens. And the author's making the case that in this monarchy, in the system of power that was constructed within Egypt, the ruling elite would turn to women when it was their final and only option. And there was a way in which it was considered that having a woman on the throne could create a sort of equilibrium for the society, for the culture, so that the elite could prosper and there would be a very like chill equilibrium. And the author is then looking at how sometimes when these queens would rule, how were they ruling? What was the decisions that they made? And then looking at how in the next generation, once that queen died, how society and the new rulers, primarily men, would construct rules to make it so that women couldn't rule. And it's just a really interesting read and a way to consider ancient Egypt and power and this very interesting time. And it kind of then ties into some more of the nonfiction reading that I did. We'll get there in a little bit, but yeah, that was that book. I found it to be really fascinating. After that, I read Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland. Now, this is another one of those Patrick Rodden Keefe books. He's quite a great author. Most of his books seem to be really, really great. But this one is looking at the Troubles in Ireland, and there's a way in which it starts with the story of the disappearance of Jean McConville, who had about 10 children. And her children saw her get taken, and this obviously ruins their life. It is the defining moment of their life, and they all, unfortunately, because of the state stepping in and like separating them, they end up having very splintered lives away from each other and are always haunted by the specter of their mother. And that is the scene that the book opens with, and then the author gives us more information about the Troubles and who were the power players and how was it that young people were, sorry, there's like people outside. How were young people getting involved in this fight for freedom, and who were the, what do you call them? Paramilitary forces who felt very just in their quest for freedom and their use of violence. And you see how, you know, you have these people going about doing these things, and like, what was the everyday people who weren't enacting in violence but had to live in the society, like how are they coping with this, and how that also weighs on their mind. And then you see the ways in which the people who were doing the violence, like the author takes us through their journey of like when they were young, and then, you know, 20-30 years later, like what do they think of what they did, and looking at the stories of what was that woman's name? Dolores Price and her sister, who end up going to jail and become, they are freedom fighters, but they become like icons, and their names mean something, and the author's looking at their life. And then also looking at Jerry Adams, who was sort of like in the paramilitary force, but not someone who enacted violence, but a tactician, and how he ends up changing the direction of the IRA and what the aftermath of his decisions are. And I just think it was a very well done look at a time in history that wasn't that long ago, you know, like we're talking about the 80s and 70s. So if you like that book, I would then suggest reading We Don't Know Ourselves by Fintan O'Toole. The next book I want to talk about is The Secret History of the Mongol Queens, How the Daughters of Genghis Khan Rescued His Empire. This is something that I thought was really fascinating. It pairs quite well with When Women Ruled the World, and it's the kind of thing that I find myself wishing that I knew more about this when I was younger. I just think it does a disservice to us in the West that we don't know more of these stories like within our own schooling, and you have to like go about it on your own to get more information on this. But basically, the author sets us up that when Genghis Khan, like we start with learning a little bit more about how Genghis Khan came into power. He didn't come into power until like his 40s. So for those of you who are young and feel like you've not accomplished anything, don't worry, you still have time. And the author then looks at, okay, when Genghis Khan is in power, what are the systems that he sets in place for his empire? One of them, and the most important, I guess you could say, at least for this work, is how he makes it so that his daughters have quite a bit of power. He spreads them out throughout the empire that he ends up amassing, and they are instrumental in maintaining the equilibrium of the culture of the empire, if you would. And once he dies, there is a time in which his daughters are able to rule for a little bit of time. We see from about 1206 to 1241, they are in power, but then the men in their life start to react negatively and want to curtail their power. And set about doing that, there's this one horrible like rape scene that is described that is really quite brutal. Then you go from there to learning about how Genghis Khan's daughters are no longer ruling, but other women are ruling, and their ability to control the empire and the succession struggles that occur with the males in their life. And then we move on to seeing how like the empire starts to dwindle because things get a little too obsessed with security and luxury, and they start to fall away from their nomadic roots. And we see this new Mongol princess in the years like 1470 and how she goes about trying to reunite the empire. And I thought it was really fascinating. It was gripping. I kind of want to reread it. Maybe I'll do that after this, but it just gave me a lot of really fascinating anecdotes and stories, and just a different way to contemplate ruling an empire. The next book that I want to talk about, the final book, if you would, is Into Siberia, George Kennan's epic journey through the brutal frozen heart of Russia. This book was delightful. I don't know why. I was just so enamored by this book. So George Kennan, there are two George Kennans. There's one who ends up doing a lot of policy, and like he's a nephew, I think you could say, of the original George Kennan. I'm pretty sure, something like that. And then there's like George Kennan the Elder, this guy who was wanted to like see life, and he gets himself onto this expedition to go to Russia. That's his first foray there. Then he comes back to the US, and then he's like, I need to get back out there, because when he was in the States, he's kind of speaking about how he thinks that the Russian exile system is quite honorable, and that's a great way to treat, political dissidents. And then he goes to Russia, and he goes to Siberia, and he meets these people, he meets the political dissidents, and he's like, actually, the system of exile is horrible. It is bad. It is not good. You're literally curtailing this like intellectual society and giving them the worst kind of torture, because they are in these isolated areas. They're maybe unable to practice their art or unable to talk to people. And he's learning a lot about how, at this time, women were really the proponents of change and revolution. And he's meeting all of these fascinating women and seeing these like different Russian like subcultures, and I found myself really gripped by it, because also at the same time, while he's experiencing all of this, he's has to deal with frostbite and the really intense like conditions of Russia and Siberia, and the snow and the cold, and they're riding on sleds. It was just something that, because travel writing has been something that has been on my mind, it's just, this is a kind of a way of life that is no longer in existence, especially because this book is about what, like 1885 or whatever, like, it's a very different time now. But yeah, it set me off on like looking at all of these images and learning more, and I just think it was a great read. Would recommend it. You got to check it out. Yeah, okay, that is my nonfiction reading for the year of 2024. I would love to hear if you've read any nonfiction books that you really enjoyed, or you think that I would like, or you think that someone in the comments might like, or maybe you have a resolution in 2025 to read more nonfiction. I personally would really recommend it. I think my nonfiction reading is sometimes better than my fiction reading. And with that, I will see you in the next video. Thanks, bye.